Hi guys, we're on the final stretch here, and so the last step in this process is basically just to confirm that everything that we did in the setup process here is actually working correctly. Now, one thing that you could do in theory is to install the Etcdctl utility on a dev system and attempt to connect to the etcd cluster nodes using that utility. However, in this particular example, this is actually a bit nicer because they're using a container on one of the dev systems here to actually run Etcdctl inside of a container and then connect out to the etcd service. So what you're going to see is that there's a couple of variables here. The first one is the etcd tag, and then we can find that in the pod manifest that was just generated by these kubeadm init commands right up here. And then the other variable here is the actual IP address of the node that you want to connect to. So what I'm going to do is just copy this command into my editor here. So I'm going to fire up VS Code. We'll just paste this in. And we need to change this etcd tag here, or actually rather define it. Let's do export etcd tag equals. And then what value are we going to set for this? Well, we want to match it up with the version of etcd that we're actually running, and we can explore the pod manifest that was just created with the kubeadm init command to figure out which version we should be using. So you should be able to do this on any of these nodes, but I'm just going to go back to node number 1 here for the sake of simplicity. And we're going to go to the etc Kubernetes directory here, go to manifests, and that's where our etcd YAML file is. So let's go ahead and just cat that file. And if you scroll up in this pod spec configuration, you'll see that we have just a standard pod resource that you would find in a Kubernetes cluster, but in this case, we're just running it directly against the kubelet. We're not actually deploying it to a Kubernetes master node because we haven't deployed the API server, the scheduler, the controller manager. We're basically just running the kubelet itself locally on each of these nodes in our cluster at the moment. But under the pod spec here, we have the container section, and there is a single container here defined as a etcd container. And you can see the image tag that's associated with this pod manifest. So what we want to do is just copy the version after the colon there, and this is going to be the version tag for that container image that we're going to be using to test out etcd. So we're basically just matching that up, and we'll bring that over into our script here, paste that in. So now when we run this Docker command, it's going to substitute this value for this variable right here. And then we need to also make sure that back on this first script that we created, that these variables are set as well. Otherwise, it won't know how to reference these host variables. So if you've exited or lost your connection to your remote system, go ahead and just run those export commands to make sure you define all these variables. And then we should be able to run our little script here to do a test. Now, this probably looks a little bit confusing for you, so let me just kind of break down what's happening here. So we're calling the Docker CLI, and we're going to run a new container, and we're going to connect it to the host network interface. So rather than having a bridged network connection where you connect to a NAT network for the Docker bridge network, we're actually going to run this container directly connected to the host's network interface. And so it'll have the host's IP address, and it'll be able to connect to the host's network adapter directly on a particular port. Now, the other parameters that are being specified here are we have a volume mapping, so we're basically mapping the etc Kubernetes directory on the host itself into the etc Kubernetes directory inside the container. And the reason we need to do that is so that we have access to the certificate files that are sitting inside of the etc Kubernetes directory on the host. If we don't do this volume mapping, then the container that's running Etcdctl would not have access to all of the certificate files that we generated as part of the setup process. So that's why we have that volume mount in there. And then you can see that we're pointing to our etcd container image here with the specified version right up here. And then we're actually calling inside of that container, we're going to then invoke the etcdctl command line utility. And the etcd command line utility has a bunch of its own parameters that allow you to determine how to connect to a particular node. So we're going to need to pass in the node's public key certificate, that's --cert. And this is getting passed into Etcdctl itself. It's not getting passed into Docker. This is actually an argument to Etcdctl. Same thing for the private key, the key parameter. That's going to be the node's private key. And then we're also going to need to specify the public key certificate for the certificate authority so that Etcdctl can validate that the node's key was actually successfully signed by the certificate authority. And then finally, the endpoints parameter here basically tells Etcdctl which node it should be connecting to run different commands. So these are kind of all your connection setup parameters right here. These 4 parameters: cert, which is the public key for the node; key, which is the private key for the node; CA cert, which is the CA's public key certificate that's common across all nodes in the cluster; and then finally endpoints down here that allows us to specify what our valid endpoints are as an array. And then after that, once we've done all of our connection setup, then we can actually specify what command in Etcdctl we want to run. And Etcdctl has a subcommand called endpoint health, and then you can say, I want to display the entire cluster health with the -- cluster parameter. So that's kind of how this command is working. I know it can look a little bit confusing because you kind of have an Etcdctl command embedded inside of a larger Docker command, but that's kind of how things are working here. So we'll copy that and paste it in. Of course, I need to include line number 1 right up there as well. So let's paste all of that in. And as you can see, etcd, the container image, was not found locally, so it's just going to download that from Google Container Registry. And then once it's downloaded it, it's going to run the endpoint health command here against the entire cluster, and it's going to locate all of the nodes in the cluster and ensure that they are healthy. So that's how we can validate that our etcd cluster is actually up and running. As you can see, each of the nodes in the cluster is reporting back as healthy. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.